Today's hearing will examine the President's defense budget request. Our witnesses today are the Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, General Martin Dempsey, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Also joining him at the witness table is the Undersecretary and Controller of the Department of Defense, Robert Hale. I want to particularly thank Secretary Panetta for being here today. It's been some time since the Secretary of Defense has appeared before the Senate Budget Committee. As a former OMB Director and a former House Budget Committee Chairman, Secretary Panetta understands the important role of the Budget Committee, and we especially appreciate his willingness to appear here today. Secretary Panetta gave me a commitment that he would come, and I very much appreciate his keeping that promise. We look forward to his testimony as well as that of General Dempsey and Controller Hale. We also very much understand the time constraints that you are under. We recognize that you have many issues on your plate, especially with what is happening in Syria and Iran and the Middle East, and of course North Korea and China and Russia, and on it goes. So we do recognize the heavy burden that's on your shoulder, and we will keep our commitment to get you out of here as expeditiously as possible. I want to begin by highlighting the budget crisis facing the country. Despite the progress in the last summer's Budget Control Act, we remain on what is fundamentally an unsustainable course. Admiral Mullen, General Dempsey's predecessor as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, described the national debt as our biggest national security threat. I understand General Dempsey may not share that exact assessment, but I think nonetheless recognizes this is a key challenge facing the country. We simply will not be able to remain a global superpower if we fail to stop the explosion of debt. And we're now at a gross debt 100% of GDP. What is of even greater concern is where we are headed, because Congressional Budget Office tells us if we stay on our current course, we're headed for a debt well over 230% of GDP. Under CBO's alternative fiscal scenario, gross federal debt will reach 103% of GDP this year, well above the 90% threshold that many economists believe as the beginning of the danger zone. And it will continue rising to 120% by 2022 and well beyond that in the years beyond 2022. The reality is that defense spending, both in the core defense budget and in war costs, has grown dramatically and has been a factor in contributing to recent deficits. In 1997, we spent $254 billion on the Department of Defense. In 2012, when we include war costs, we'll spend about $645 billion on the department, which is down slightly from the peak in 2010. All of the decline from 2010 to 2012 came from a reduction in war cost. The core Department of Defense budget has been about flat since 2010, but remained at a very high level. If we compare recent overall defense spending and budget function 050 to recent non-defense discretionary spending, we can see that overall defense funding has remained at about $554 billion since 2010, not including war costs, while non-defense funding has fallen from $540 billion to $489 billion in 2012. So of the discretionary pot, basically defense is level, non-defense down slightly. Looking forward, the President is proposing a small reduction in Department of Defense funding in 2013, bringing it down from $530 billion in 2012 to $525 billion in 2013. Over the next 10 years, the President's Department of Defense request would roughly match the levels set in the Budget Control Act, not including the sequester. As we can see from the blue line on this chart, the President's request would provide a steady increase in the defense budget from 2013 on. The red line on this chart shows what would happen to Department of Defense funding if the sequester were implemented. We would see a much steeper drop in 2013, but then steady growth after that. I believe the steep drop in 2013 required by a sequester would be a mistake. But I also believe further reductions beyond the Budget Control Act levels must be considered. The green line represents the proposed Department of Defense funding under the so-called Simpson-Bowles plan, which would provide a smaller drop in 2013 than the sequester, but slower growth in funding after that. Obviously, all of these have to be reviewed in light of the defense threat that we face at the time decisions are made. All of us understand budgets are taken at a point in time, and we all understand that there are threats facing this country that are unpredictable. As I noted, war costs have started to come down. Overall war funding dropped from $159 billion in 2011 to $115 billion in 2012. The President's budget provides $86 billion in 2013 for war costs, and then includes a plug number of $44 billion a year for the remainder of the 10 years. This next chart puts our defense spending in a historical perspective. We can see that even with the drop in war costs included in the President's budget, defense spending would remain very high by historical standards, near the peaks of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Reagan defense buildup during the Cold War. Defense spending came down more dramatically following those conflict periods. Now, we all understand none of these periods can just be easily compared, because we face a different threat environment now than we faced after those conflicts. I want to conclude with a quote from the former Defense Secretary Robert Gates. In an interview on CBS's 60 Minutes last year, he said this: "The budget of the Pentagon almost doubled during the last decade, but our capabilities didn't particularly expand. A lot of that money went into infrastructure and overhead, and frankly, I think a culture that had an open checkbook." Well, we can't afford an open checkbook anymore. I recognize the administration has already taken steps to eliminate some inefficiencies in the Defense Department and to end some unnecessary or wasteful programs, and we applaud that. But we know that we're going to have to do more. I have always been a very strong supporter of defense spending because I believe providing for the national defense is the government's core responsibility. And make no mistake, Congress will continue to provide our troops everything they need to complete the missions that they are assigned and to keep them safe. And we have to, of course, recognize that we still face very serious potential new threats. I mentioned some earlier. I want to focus on Iran, Syria, the Middle East, Pakistan. These are all of deep concern to members of this committee. I know they're of deep concern to you, Secretary Panetta, and your entire defense team. But given the fiscal crisis that we confront, we're going to have to find more savings in the core defense budget. We can't rely solely on declining war costs for savings, and we need to ensure that every dollar going to defense is essential to promoting the country's national security.